Hello, everyone. Professor Philip Travis here. War and Society this week, week 5, as we look at the United States' 20th century and the role that American war or involvement in conflicts have played in shaping American society. This week, we continue our look at the First World War, and we delve deeper into the reading of our book, Democracy's Prisoner, as you see here. We'll have 2 quizzes this week, and one quiz will be on last week's assigned reading, as we've done earlier in the term, the Herring reading in this case, and also a quiz on our reading here. It's important that that we're getting into this book and really reading this book, because next week we'll be having our first exam. And the way that exam will work is it's a major essay. It involves a major essay in which you need to connect. You need to connect as the backbone. Developments in this book. You need to make a thesis that connects sort of your reading of this book as a main backbone of the essay with some of the other readings we've covered so far in the class. You don't have to use all of them, but definitely several of them that we've used in the class in addition to the book. So I would be looking for probably your use of Democracy's Prisoner and then 2 other assigned readings from this portion of the class in writing that essay, in making an argument that connects the First World War and the Philippine-American War to larger changes occurring in American society. And of course, next week there will be a further prompt on that exam, so you can think more about this. But it's very important that we have an understanding of what's happening in this book, to read this book. Remember, too, this last week I asked us to identify in the discussion forum the thesis of the book. And it's important to note that when you get a work of history, historians usually, we're very good at writing introductions. And so in this case it's called a prologue, but it's the introduction of the book. The historian will always tell you the setup of the book in the introduction or the prologue. And likewise, though there might be a number of different channels to it, the scholar of history will also explain the thesis of the book. And it's very important that we do sort of get the thesis statement, the idea behind the book, well understood as we move forward with this book. So I saw some of us in the discussion forum look like some of us were getting pretty close to it. So that's good, and I'll be looking over your discussion posts as I grade them, and I'll give you guidance with respect to the thesis. War and Society, the First World War. The image that you're seeing here on the screen, of course, is an example of one way that war shaped society. In this case, the example is a pandemic. World War I became associated. This is a Kansas military hospital where American soldiers ill with the flu which became known as the Spanish flu, ravaged the United States and the world. Now, the term, by the way, the Spanish flu, is a misnomer because it implies that it came from Spain, which isn't actually the case. It's almost certainly the case that this flu originated in the United States. But the reason it became known as the Spanish flu is because the first public case was a member of the Spanish royal family. That was publicized. But the flu, once it kind of arrived in World War Europe, if you will, spread amongst the armies, and as the armies traveled home, it went back to those countries, creating a massive, virulent pandemic. And that's certainly one way that it shaped American society. It would have shaped in the year and a half after the war. It would have shaped perceptions of America, of Americans, about a myriad of things in terms of the war and the aftermath of the war. Of course, and this will be our brief summary factor for the week, and it comes from our reading, and I want us our reading from last week. and I wanted us to really kind of have an understanding of this. Another way that the First World War shaped American society was really in a fundamental transformation of politics, governing, and as it relates to international affairs. So last week, and of course you saw it in PDF, but this is the book that PDF was from, by one of my mentors, actually, George Herring. And what we see with the First World War is we see the emergence of sort of, and Herring identifies really three major groups when it comes to American politics and international affairs. And these three groups were, on the one hand, conservative internationalists, and then on the other hand, sort of progressive internationalists, and then isolationists. And these new sort of categories of figures in the greater political and policy-making apparatus of the United States was a new development that was very much in communication with the legacy and history of the United States. Isolationism as a term had never really even existed before the First World War because it had never really needed to come up. It was in the 19th century, it was sort of taken for granted that the United States didn't generally get involved in major conflicts on particularly the other side of the Atlantic. Now you have some cases, of course, right? Of course, the United States fought the Philippine-American War, and we saw the emergence of the Anti-Imperialist League as a result of this. So it wasn't that it was completely born only of the First World War, but generally speaking, the term isolationism is a term that emerged in the American sort of lexicon, if you will, of policy, politics, and international relations as a result of the United States' emergence as a world power in the first half of the 20th century. And during the 19th century, it was taken for granted that the United States was a continental power. It would expand west in its own form of sort of continental imperialism. It was an expansionist power, but it wasn't an overseas power. It was sort of taken for granted that the United States would not be getting involved in major wars in places like Europe. Well, with the First World War, the new conversations about the role of the United States in the world, isolationism became a new political term. And in the lead up to the Second World War, it was a rather devastating political sort of view for people to adopt, because it was, of course, largely isolationism. Excuse me. It was largely isolationism that was to blame for the lack of preparedness of the United States to become involved in the Second World War. And of course, the lack of preparedness, the lack of interest of the United States to be involved in the Second World War really meant that when the United States did ultimately become involved in the Second World War, that the full scale of the atrocity happening in the world was really already going to carry out. That the United States could play a role in defeating Nazi Germany, but the full scale of the atrocity at that point was really too late to be reversed, and that was largely due to the powerful role that isolationism played in American politics and policymaking in the 1930s. So summarize this is the factoid. I just want us to get this from the reading. Conservative internationalists after the First World War involved intellectual, conservative political thinkers like William Howard Taft, for example, who believed the United States, they believed in collective security, but they believed the United States should have a strong military, be military armed, and prepared in the world to effectively maintain and pursue its interests in the world. Progressive internationalists, which included Americans like Jane Addams, for example, they sought to not turn to sort of military buildups and arms races, but to rather use sanctions and arms reduction strategies to try to avoid war, largely because their biggest goal was to end more important things as they saw them domestically: poverty, homelessness, need for education, healthcare, these types of things. And then, of course, the isolationist side of things, which effectively said the United States does not have a place in these types of international bodies and organizations, and it should remain isolated in the continent across the Atlantic. So summarize that in the Extra Credit Discussion Forum. And there's no discussion this week, just 2 quizzes, but please let me know if you have any questions, and make sure you really get into Democracy's Prisoner. One of those quizzes will relate to this book, and the other one will relate to our reading from last week. So please make sure, if you need to review that reading, that's good. Obviously, make sure you get into the Democracy's Prisoner book. I will give us a specific area from the book that I will quiz you on. I'm not going to quiz you on the whole entire book, but I do want to make sure that we're looking at it pretty closely, so that's why we're doing that. So let's have a great week this week, and let me know if you have any questions.